Colette Aram's killer never slipped away into the night. For 26 years, while a terrified nation hunted a ghost, he lived streets away from the family he destroyed. He shopped at the same corner stores. He walked the same pavements her mother walked every single day. At some point, in some small, unremarkable way, he likely stood in the same room as people who loved her, at a wake, at a memorial, at a fundraiser for the very investigation meant to catch him. The police hunt for Colette's killer would stretch across the entire country, generating thousands of tips from cities he'd never set foot in. And the whole time, the man they wanted was a few hundred yards from her front door, watching the search from his own living room window. This is the case that forced British television to launch its first ever criminal appeal show. And it began on an ordinary Sunday night, in a village that had never needed to be afraid. Keyworth sat in the English Midlands, a small pocket of Nottinghamshire on the edge of coal country, where entire towns still ran on the rhythm of the pits. October of 1983 was cold and damp, the kind of autumn evening where fog settled low over the fields by 6 o'clock, and the smell of coal smoke hung in the air from 100 chimneys. Britain was a country on edge that year, heading toward an industrial standoff that would tear the region apart within months. But none of that touched Keyworth. Out here, the roads were narrow, unlit, bordered by hedgerows instead of streetlights. There was no CCTV, no mobile phones to call for help. Darkness here meant something different than it does now. Total, rural, uninterrupted. And for as long as anyone could remember, that darkness had never once felt dangerous. Inside the Aram house that evening, Sunday had the shape every Sunday had. The television offered only a handful of channels, most of them already switched off for the night. Dinner had been eaten. The day was folding itself down into something quiet and small. Colette was 16, training as a hairdresser, and she had a boyfriend named Russell Godfrey. He was 17, freshly licensed, still riding the novelty of being able to drive anywhere he wanted. He usually collected her himself. It had become their routine, the car doing the work, so she never had to walk those roads alone in the dark. But that Sunday, his car sat dead in the garage. For a boy who just tasted the freedom of a license, a broken engine wasn't a small inconvenience. It was a wall between him and the plans he'd made. So, Colette would walk. Her mother stood at the window for a moment before she said anything, looking out at the dark line of the road. Nothing about the night looked wrong. It looked like every other night, but something in her pulled anyway. Some instinct with no evidence behind it, and she offered to drive her instead. Colette waved it off. She was 16. It was a clear, mild night, and a 20-minute walk was nothing. She promised to be home by 9:30, hugged her mother at the door, and said the last words her mother would ever hear her say. Then she stepped outside. The walk to Russell's house followed the same route she'd taken dozens of times, down her street, onto the main road, up toward Nicker Hill, a stretch of pavement so familiar it barely registered as a decision anymore. Just after 8 o'clock, she started walking. A few minutes later, the phone rang at the house. Russell, checking if she'd left yet. Her mother told him she was already on her way. Rather than wait, Russell pulled his bike out and set off to meet her halfway. A small, unremarkable choice that would end up mattering more than he could have known. He rode out into the cold, the tires cutting through the quiet, his breath visible in the October air. At first, he wasn't looking for anything. He was just riding, expecting to see her any second, expecting the shape of her to appear somewhere along the hedgerows ahead. A minute passed, then several. The road stayed empty. What had started as a simple ride to meet his girlfriend halfway began, without him quite noticing the shift, to feel like something else. He scanned the dark tree lines a little harder. He slowed down without meaning to. Somewhere in that stretch of road, expectation quietly turned into puzzlement. Colette was nowhere. The car honked twice before Karen Willis even understood she was being watched. She was walking to see her own boyfriend that same night, on a street not far from Colette's route. A car pulled up close behind her, then passed, then slowed. The horn cut through the quiet. Once, then again, a few seconds later. She didn't recognize the car or the man behind the wheel. All she felt was a sudden, sharp unease, the kind that makes you walk faster without deciding to. She picked up her pace. Up ahead, she spotted a couple walking together and moved toward them, using their presence like a shield. The car didn't follow her all the way in. She made it to her destination safely, shaken but fine. She had no way of knowing she'd just described the same man, the same car, that would take her best friend within the hour. Back at the Aram house, the phone still hadn't rung the way it should have. Russell had ridden the length of the road twice now, and there was still no sign of her. He turned back toward her house, hoping for some boring, ordinary explanation. There wasn't one. He called again. Her mother picked up, and this time, there was nothing reassuring to say. By 9 o'clock, the ordinary timeline had completely collapsed. The phone inside the house became a countdown tool. Friends, neighbors, relatives, every call dialing out into the village came back with the exact same answer. No one had seen her. By 10 o'clock, they were calling emergency rooms. By 10:30, the police. Officers arrived and walked the route with the family, retracing every step of a walk that should have taken 20 minutes. They checked hedgerows, gardens, and the sides of the road. There was no sign of a struggle, no dropped bag, no torn clothing, nothing knocked over. It was as if she'd simply stopped existing partway through a sentence. One officer would later describe it as looking for someone who had vanished into thin air. The search was called off for the night, with a promise to resume at first light. Nobody in that house went to bed. Morning came gray and quiet. A man driving to work early spotted a shape in the field, low against the ground, completely still. He slowed his car, turned it around, and realized he was looking at a girl. At almost the exact same time, a few miles away, Colette's brother Mark was out in his own car, doing what everyone else in the family had been doing since the night before, driving, searching, checking every lane he could think of. He didn't know a body had already been found. He didn't know police were already on their way to that same field. He turned down Thirlby Lane and saw the police tape first, then the cars. An officer moved to stop him at the edge of the cordon, telling him to stay back. Mark didn't stop. He pushed past the officers, breaking through the tape, close enough to see exactly what was lying in the grass. It was an image that would never leave him. Colette Aram was found that morning, less than 2 miles from her own front door, in a field just off a quiet country lane. What had happened to her in the hours since she left home would take investigators years to fully piece together. But some of it was already horribly clear. She had not simply disappeared. Something had been done to her. And whoever had done it hadn't run far. In fact, in the minutes after leaving her in that field, he did something so ordinary, so unbothered, that no one watching him would have suspected a single thing. He went and got something to eat. They wouldn't let Colette's mother see her. Someone had to identify the body, and the family decided it should be Tony, Colette's father, and her grandfather, Arthur. They went together to the mortuary. What they saw in that room, neither of them would ever fully describe out loud. Arthur was 65, a strong man, the kind who'd built a business with his own hands and never once complained about his health. 6 months later, he was dead. A heart condition nobody had flagged before that morning at the mortuary. The family never said it directly, but they didn't have to. Colette's murder had already claimed a second life before anyone had even found the man responsible. While the family absorbed one impossible loss after another, detectives were working backward through the hours before her death, trying to build a timeline out of nothing. It started 5 miles away, near a set of riding stables outside the village. A man had been seen there earlier that day, waiting inside an old hut for hours. Witnesses would later say girls often rode horses nearby on Sunday afternoons. Whatever he was waiting for, it wasn't hard to guess. At some point that afternoon, a red Ford Fiesta appeared near the stables. Within minutes, it was gone. Stolen, right there in broad daylight, by a man who now had exactly what he needed to move quickly and quietly through the village. For the next several hours, that stolen car crawled through Keyworth streets. More than one young girl would later tell police about a car slowing beside her, a driver asking directions to a road that was barely 50 yards away, an obvious excuse to get a better look. One girl was asked if she wanted a lift. She said no and kept walking. She had no idea, in that moment, how close she'd come to being the story instead of a witness in it. One resident, further along the road, noticed something else entirely. The same man was walking near his car, carrying what looked like a knife. He wrote down the number plate. By the time Colette Aram left her house that evening, the man in the red Fiesta had already spent hours failing to find what he was looking for. Then he found her. Roughly 20 minutes after Colette Aram was murdered, a man walked into a pub a few miles from where her body would later be found. He sat down and ordered a meal. A drink, orange and lemonade, an odd choice for a grown man, memorable enough that the landlady would recall it years later without hesitation. He made small talk, told her he was in the area visiting a friend. Nothing about him seemed alarming at first, just another stranger passing through on a quiet Sunday night. Then he got up and asked where the toilet was. When he came back, the landlady noticed something on his hands, blood, faint but visible, in the creases of his knuckles. He caught her looking. For a brief second, something in his expression shifted, like a man realizing he'd made a mistake. He didn't run, he didn't panic. He simply excused himself, finished his food, and walked back out into the night, as if nothing at all had happened. Inside that gent's toilet, he dried his hands on a paper towel and dropped it in the bin. Nobody understood what they were looking at. A stained scrap of paper, tossed out with the rest of the evening's rubbish. It would sit there, unremarkable, waiting for a piece of technology that didn't exist yet. By the next morning, the village was completely overrun. Nottinghamshire police launched a scorched earth manhunt, throwing hundreds of officers into door-to-door sweeps. Within weeks, detectives had logged over 2,000 separate statements. On paper, they had everything they needed. Almost overnight, neighbors who had known each other for years began looking at one another a little differently, wondering, quietly, if the man responsible might still be living right there among them. He was. Detectives now had a physical description. They had a stolen car. They had the DNA from the pub gents, connected to the exact same night as the murder. By any reasonable measure, they were close. Closer than anyone in that incident room probably realized. And yet, the case would remain unsolved for the next 26 years. Every case on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. Each episode takes nearly 15 days of research and long nights chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going, and if you want to watch more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. The letter arrived 5 weeks after the murder, addressed to the police, written in handwriting nobody could quite place. At first glance, it looked deliberately strange. The letters were slanted, drawn with a ruler in places, as if someone had gone out of their way to disguise their own hand. Detectives turned it over, unsure at first whether it was simply a cruel hoax. Then they read it properly. It described specific details of the attack that had never been released to the public, things only the killer could have known. It claimed he'd worn a mask plucked from a Halloween display. And near the bottom, a single arrogant line. "You will never get me." Whoever had written it had also left something behind he never meant to. A single fingerprint, pressed faintly into the paper near the edge. A mistake. The kind of small, careless slip that should have ended everything right there. Except a fingerprint is only useful if you already have someone to match it against. And they didn't. Not yet. So, the letter went into evidence alongside the paper towel, alongside every witness statement collected in those first frantic weeks. And the investigation kept moving, chasing a man who existed only as a shape built out of secondhand memories and a few slanted lines on a page. Then the ground shifted under all of it. 1984 turned into one of the most turbulent years in modern British history. A national miners' strike tore through the country, pulling officers away from ordinary casework and into the middle of a labor conflict that consumed entire police forces for months. Resources that should have gone toward tracking down one man in one small Nottinghamshire village were suddenly needed everywhere else at once. The case didn't officially close. Nobody ever told the family it was over. But somewhere between 12 and 18 months in, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, the investigation quietly shrank. Fewer officers, fewer new leads to chase, a file that got opened less and less. The man who had promised, in his own handwriting, that he would never be caught, appeared to be right. Then came a chance nobody expected. In June of that year, a brand new television program launched on the BBC, built around a simple idea: reconstruct unsolved crimes, put them in front of millions of people at once, and ask the public directly for help. Colette Aram's case was chosen to be the very first story it ever told. On the night it aired, a phone number sat on screen the entire time. Detectives sat by banks of ringing telephones, watching call after call come in from every corner of the country. By the end of the night, they'd logged more than 400 of them. Somewhere in that flood of calls was one that stood apart from all the rest. A woman rang in, her voice shaking. She said she knew who had killed Colette Aram. She started to give details, then stopped. She was crying too hard to continue. The line went dead. She called back a second time. The same thing happened. Partway through, overwhelmed, she hung up again. She never called a third time. Investigators had no name, no number, nothing to trace her by. Whatever she knew, whoever she suspected, it disappeared the moment that second call ended. 400 calls. A letter with a fingerprint on it. A description built from a dozen different witnesses. A stolen car, a knife, a paper towel with blood on it, sitting quietly in an evidence room. And still, nothing. The case that had launched a revolution in British television couldn't solve its own. The line went cold. The files went into cardboard boxes. And while a village tried to heal, the man who wrote that letter simply walked out into the sunshine and began building a perfectly normal life. He smiled for the camera, standing beside a local dignitary at a community event, dressed sharp, comfortable, completely at ease. Nobody in that room knew the man in that photograph had murdered a 16-year-old girl. Nobody knew the dignitary standing next to him, smiling for the exact same photo, was related to her. That's who he'd become. A husband again. A father of more children. A man people trusted enough to hand him responsibility. School events, charity work, the kind of quiet civic roles reserved for people considered decent. He built all of it on top of what he'd done, brick by brick, year by year, and nobody around him ever thought to look underneath. While he lived that life, somewhere else, in a lab, scientists were trying to catch up to him. In the late 90s, someone finally attempted to pull a usable genetic profile from the evidence sitting in storage since 1983. It didn't work, not really. The technology of the time could only manage fragments, pieces too small and too incomplete to build anything solid. Hope rose briefly, and then quietly deflated. Years passed. The science kept improving in the background, the way science always does, without anyone in Keyworth necessarily noticing. Then, a second attempt. This time, it worked. A complete genetic profile, pulled from evidence that had been waiting patiently for over 2 decades. For a moment, it must have felt like the case was finally about to break wide open. It wasn't. They ran the profile against the national database. Nothing. No match. The man they were looking for had never been arrested for anything else in his entire life. He'd left behind a complete genetic fingerprint, and it pointed at absolutely no one. So investigators tried something else. If the man himself wasn't on record, maybe a relative was. They began searching for partial matches. Brothers, cousins, anyone who shared enough genetic material to narrow the search. The list came back with hundreds of names. One by one, investigators worked through it, contacting people, comparing samples, ruling names out, one after another, month after month. Not him, not him, not him. The list got shorter, but the answer never got closer. Hundreds of names, and every single one led nowhere. At some point during all of this, as police activity around old cold cases picked up again, the man felt the walls creeping in. So, he did something extraordinary. He told his family he was sick, seriously sick. He described treatment, appointments, the whole fabricated shape of an illness he never had. And to make it convincing, to make sure nobody questioned it, he pulled out his own hair, strand by strand, until it looked like something a hospital would have done to him. His family believed him. Why wouldn't they? He was their husband, their father, the man who showed up to school events and stood for photographs and never gave anyone a single reason to doubt him. He let people who loved him grieve for a disease that didn't exist, just to buy himself a little more invisibility. That's the shape of what he was willing to do to protect a secret that had already cost one family everything. Investigators had run out of names. The database had nothing. The trail that started with a paper towel and a taunting letter had led, after years of work, back to an empty room. Every lead had been chased down. Every name on that list had been cleared. The man in that photograph, still smiling, still trusted, still completely unknown to the people investigating his own crime, remained exactly what he'd been for over 2 decades, a phantom. It would take something almost meaningless, some small, unrelated moment hundreds of miles from anyone's radar, to finally put a name to the man standing in that picture. In June of 2008, a young man was pulled over for a routine motoring offense. Nothing dramatic, the kind of stop that happens 1,000 times a day across the country. As part of the standard procedure, police took a DNA swab. When that sample went into the system, something flagged. His profile was close, unnervingly close, to the genetic fingerprint pulled from evidence in a 26-year-old murder case. For a moment, it must have looked like the answer detectives had been chasing for decades. Then reality caught up. He was only 20 years old. He hadn't even been born yet when Colette Aram was murdered. He wasn't the man they were looking for. He was his son. The match was too specific to be a coincidence. Somewhere in that young man's family, investigators now knew, was the person responsible. They pulled the threads further and found 4 brothers from an area in South Nottinghamshire. One of them had already died. That left 3. On a single morning in April 2009, police moved on all 3 at once. Officers arrived at each address in the same coordinated sweep, arresting all 3 surviving brothers before any of them could warn the others. One of them had been living just a few streets away from where that stolen red Fiesta had been spotted the night of the murder, all those years ago. His name was Paul Hutchinson. Investigators pulled the letter out of storage. The one written 26 years earlier, disguised handwriting, a single fingerprint pressed near the edge, a line boasting that he'd never be caught. They matched it to Hutchinson's prints. It was him. His DNA matched the evidence from the crime scene. It matched the paper towel from the pub. Every piece of physical evidence collected in 1983, every fragment that had sat waiting through decades of failed searches, pointed to the exact same man. Hutchinson tried one last move. He told police it wasn't him. He said it must have been his brother, the one who'd already died, conveniently unable to defend himself. But investigators had already thought of that. They'd pulled a blood sample the brother had left behind at a hospital years earlier, long before any of this began. They tested it. It wasn't a match. The lie collapsed the moment it left his mouth. In December 2009, Hutchinson pleaded guilty. In court, he gave a full account of what happened that night. The hours spent watching from that hut near the stables, the stolen car, the attack itself. He said it plainly, without much emotion, the same way he'd apparently lived the 26 years in between. In January 2010, he was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before he could even be considered for release. He didn't serve long. Later that same year, he was found dead in his cell. He never explained why he did it. Not to police, not to his family, not to Colette's family, who had waited 26 years for exactly that answer and were left, in the end, with nothing but the fact of what he'd done. Colette Aram would have been in her 50s now. Her mother still remembers her laugh most of all. Not her face in photographs, not the last conversation they had at the door that October night. Her laugh, the specific sound of it, the thing that made her feel most like herself. She never got to finish her apprenticeship, never got the shop she talked about one day running, never got the ordinary, unremarkable life that was already laid out in front of her before an ordinary Sunday walk turned into the last thing she ever did. Justice came, eventually. 26 years late, and without the one thing that might have made it feel complete. Just a name, a sentence, a door quietly closing on a question that will never be answered. Cases like this one only get solved because people refuse to stop looking. A landlady who noticed blood on a stranger's hands. A detective who kept a paper towel nobody thought would matter. A mother who spent 26 years never giving up on a name. That's really what this channel is about. Not just telling you what happened, but honoring the people who never stopped asking why. So, here's what we want to know from you. If you'd lived in Keyworth back in 1983, would you have trusted the man in that photograph? The family man? The school volunteer? The neighbor everyone liked? Be honest. Do you think justice was actually served here when the one man who could explain why that answer to his grave took? And out of everything in this story, what's the one detail that's going to stick with you the longest? Drop your answers in the comments. We read every single one, and we reply to as many as we can. If this video kept you watching till the very end, that's the biggest compliment you can give us. So, do us a favor. Hit like. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Share this with someone who'd appreciate a case told right, not just told fast. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We bring you cases like this every single week, cases that deserve to be remembered properly. Thank you for watching and for giving Colette's story the time it deserves.